Well, a memorable day 3 of UFC 200 Fight Week is officially in the books. It started around 16 hours ago in this very room at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas with an emotional Jon Jones speaking to the press after the news broke late last night that he was out of UFC 200. It ends with an emotional Eddie Alvarez speaking to the press after winning the UFC lightweight title. What a day. There is so much to discuss. Let's get right into it. I'm Ariel Helwani, of course. That is Shaun Al-Shatti. That is Marc Raimondi. Let's talk about Eddie Alvarez first. This is a guy 2 years ago who was in MMA purgatory. He was involved in a lawsuit with Bellator, didn't know if it was going to end, had some personal issues. He talked about that a little bit tonight as well. He finally gets out. He finally gets into the UFC. His debut in this arena, by the way, doesn't go as planned. He loses to Donald Cerrone, and then things start to change for him. He beats Gilbert Melendez, he beats Anthony Pettis, and tonight he beat Rafael dos Anjos in an amazing performance. What did you think about it?
What a story. What an incredible story. Eddie Alvarez is a guy who really toiled on the fringes of the MMA mainstream for a very long time. This is a guy that fought for Bodog Fight. He was the reality fighting champion, Elite XC, Bellator, WAMA. This guy fought everywhere but the UFC for a very long period of time. He was not known by the casual fan. He was not known by the casual MMA fan, hence the name the Underground King. And now here he is, the UFC champion, the mainstream champion. He is the best in the world at 155, something that people thought 5-6 years ago when he was fighting for these obscure organizations, and now it's finally validated.
The rare first-round standing TKO victory for Eddie Alvarez against a very game Rafael dos Anjos. Just for the record, were you okay with the stoppage?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was cage side, and Rafael dos Anjos was taking a lot of shots.
Okay. So, and
also, he didn't seem to complain about it. He walked away. He was perfectly all right.
Yeah, worth noting, I thought he handled the loss with a lot of class, was giving all the props in the world to Eddie Alvarez. I feel like the UFC has kind of stumbled upon something here. You know, Eddie didn't have a ton of momentum going into this fight, but this is a guy from Philly. He's got a loyal fan base. I feel like they can do something really special with Eddie if they tell his story right. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, you saw it at the press conference here. He was almost emotional in a way. Like, he was very articulate, just describing this long, drawn-out journey that he's been on. I mean, this is a guy who, like Marc said, he's been on the fringe of the public conscience for so long. And even when he was in the UFC, I mean, you look at his past 4 wins, it's utterly ridiculous. It's the current Bellator champion. It's a former, the last WEC champion, the last Strikeforce champion, former UFC champion. Like, it's just an amazing run that this guy has been on. He is an all-time great, and it took until today, I think, for a lot of people to really recognize and understand how good he was.
And Marc, as we like to do, we always like to look ahead to what's next. There's no clear-cut #1 contender. It seems like it's a 2-horse race between Tony Ferguson, who, by the way, is fighting in 6 days in South Dakota, of all places, and Khabib Nurmagomedov, who said he didn't want to fight this summer because of Ramadan. Do you book the Khabib fight against Eddie next? Do you wait for Ferguson? What do you do next for Eddie right now?
I think you do have to at least wait for and see what Tony Ferguson does. Again, that fight.
Well, of course, they're not going to book it in the next 6 days.
That fight is very much upon us. By the time we get done with this crazy weekend, that fight will be pretty much here already. It's not a title eliminator fight because he's not fighting Michael Chiesa like he was supposed to. He's fighting Landon Venata, the prospect out of Jackson Wink. So it's not a fight that immediately jumps out and says, if you win this fight, you get a title shot. Obviously, but he's right. But he's right there on the cusp, and so is Khabib Nurmagomedov. I don't know what you do. I think you want to see how Ferguson does, and then you can go from there. If he completely dominates this kid Venata, then I think he's the front runner because Nurmagomedov he was out for 2 years. Then he fought someone who wasn't even a full-time MMA fighter, a guy who came in at short notice, a few days' notice. So I don't know if that's also a fight that you want to say gets a guy a title shot. So there's no bad option, but they have some thinking to do.
And I don't know about you, Shaun, but kind of nice to end a day like this that started with the weeping Jon Jones and that, sort of heartbreaking story and the bad audio at the press conference. Kind of nice to see a good guy, Eddie Alvarez, longtime veteran. His team is just filled with good guys, and Mark Henry. Nice to end the day on this note as we look ahead to day 4 of International Fight Week 2016, right?
Absolutely, and I think the one thing that struck me during that press conference was how realistic Eddie Alvarez was about all of this. I mean, he was talking about the lightweight division and the Shark Tank that is the lightweight division, and we keep seeing it. This belt keeps trading hands. It is such an erratic division, and I mean, he even acknowledged that, and it's going to be interesting to see. Again, this is a guy who's been in so many wars. He's been doing this for over a decade. I'm going to be interested to see how long he's able to keep this, because still nobody has been able to defend this belt more than once or twice. And maybe Eddie Alvarez is that guy, but maybe not. I mean, we'll have to see.
There is one more name that we should probably mention, and I thought Alvarez did a very nice job of selling that future fight, and his name is Conor McGregor, and we saw him a little bit earlier today. I don't know what's going to happen between Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz at 170 pounds at UFC 202. But I still feel like McGregor's best weight is probably 155. That is where Eddie Alvarez is the champion right now. Eddie Alvarez versus Conor McGregor at Madison Square Garden wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, I don't think, for the UFC.
Well, and also, let's not forget that Nate Diaz's best weight is 155, and Nate and Eddie have a history. In fact, you could go on our YouTube page. When we were back in Mexico, they had a little run in there not that long ago, so let's not forget about that as well. Other news tonight, Derek Lewis beating Roy Nelson in a fight that I think lived up to the hype. Split decision, and amazing to see Derek Lewis afterwards very much upset that this fight went the distance. I mean, this sounded like a guy who had lost the fight, and then he took a nap at the press conference. I mean, this was the reverse Robbie Lawler pre-fight press conference back in Chicago. Derek Lewis was out, sleeping, full-on sleeping. An impressive win for him. I don't think he has anything to be upset about, right? I mean, that was a solid win over a vet. He took his shots, landed some very big shots. What's he mad about?
I mean, he was saying that he's mad because he promised his fans a finish and he didn't deliver, which, I mean, that's very high expectations if you're coming in just knowing that you're going to finish Roy Nelson. But it was, I mean, what is Roy Nelson's chin made out of, man? Like, I was cage side, and I'm seeing these shots that Roy Nelson's taking, especially that last one in the last round. I don't know if it was the exact last one, but just there was one shot in the final minute of that last round where just spittle flies out of Roy Nelson's face, and that would have downed a horse, man. I don't understand what that guy's made out of it. And what does that say about Marc Hunt to be able to put that guy to sleep with one shot?
Yeah, Derek Lewis is very much for real. Also of note, Joseph Dovey, what a comeback win for him. He submits Mitch Clark in around 25 seconds via a rear naked choke, big right hand, and then he took his back. You could tell he was very happy to rebound from that loss against Dustin Poirier not that long ago, also in this very building. And Alan Jouban with an amazing victory as well. A lot of notables. It was a fun card on Fight Pass, but let's end this little wrap-up show with the big news of the evening, and that's Anderson Silva. Yes, Anderson Silva, who 24 hours ago was at home and not really training for a fight. Anderson Silva will be fighting Daniel Cormier in 48 hours at UFC 200 in a 3-round non-title light heavyweight fight. So the new main event for UFC 200 is now Miesha Tate versus Amanda Nunes for the UFC Women's Bantamweight title. Co-main event, it's now Brock Lesnar versus Marc Hunt. Then it's going to be Daniel Cormier versus Anderson Silva. Then it's going to be Frankie Edgar versus Jose Aldo for the interim featherweight title. And the first fight on pay-per-view will be Cain Velasquez versus Travis Browne. You got all that? Amazing. Anderson Silva is fighting Daniel Cormier. Your thoughts?
My thoughts is that the weigh-in is in 8 hours. This has to be the latest notice, well, it's not a main event, but latest notice high-profile fight replacement in UFC history, and it's the biggest card ever and one of the greatest fighters ever. What a weird day for. I mean, it's not just some guy filling in on short notice. It's Anderson Silva, possibly the greatest of all time, filling in about 12 hours before weigh-ins. That does not happen. It's crazy.
I would add that Joe Soto would disagree with your assessment right there.
But he was fighting on the card, Joe Soto.
That is true.
True.
He hasn't even trained. He hasn't trained, he said. He hasn't trained. He's coming off gallbladder surgery.
Less than 2 months ago. Do you like this pick, though? Do you like this pick by the UFC?
I mean, it's interesting because it's a big name. I do wonder how healthy Anderson Silva is. I mean, our own Marc Raimondi right here had this same kind of surgery.
He was medically cleared. They said he passed with, quote-unquote, flying colors somehow.
True, but what is this? I like that we're coming to this sort of, we're coming to this stage of UFC 200. It's this bicentennial, huge blowout event. And this right here perfectly encapsulates everything that mixed martial arts is about. Anderson Silva was basically thought he was going to come to Vegas to do a Hall of Fame induction for Big Nog. and he ends up fighting in a major, huge spot on one of the biggest cards ever in UFC 200. This sport is so wild, and it just throws so many curveballs at us that it is so hard to be surprised at this point.
And the great news of the day, Daniel Cormier gets paid. Distraught, they featured him on Embedded. Distraught is putting it mildly, and he gets what he wants. He gets to fight, he gets his points, he gets his purse. That's good news for good guy Daniel Cormier. So here we are. Marc this morning asked me, is this the most memorable fight week that I've ever covered? We've done well over 150 of these UFC ones at this point. We're essentially halfway through. I don't even know if we're halfway through. And this one takes the cake. Today takes the cake. Never experienced anything like today. Started with the Jon Jones press conference, then the open workout, which wasn't much of a workout. Then it was the UFC 202 press conference. Then the Ultimate Fighter finale weigh-in, and then the fights. And in between all of that, we got a new fight for Daniel Cormier with one of the greatest fighters of all time, Anderson Silva. I mean, what is tomorrow going to bring? We have no idea. But guess what? We'll be there chronicling it all for all of you. On tap for tomorrow, by the way, the UFC 200 weigh-in, and of course the Ultimate Fighter finale, Joanna Jędrzejczyk against Claudia Gadelha. We'll talk to you then. Thank you so much for sticking around all day long. Can't wait for tomorrow. But for now, we say goodnight from Las Vegas.